says the league deals show that they're warming up to the idea of legalized sports betting in the United States, which is already popular and legal in Europe.
You've got a potential captive fan base that's watching games on their phones. And how are they watching those games? Some of those games are being live streamed through the betting apps that they follow because they want to wager while they're watching the game. So you want an all-in-one solution. So that necessitates a relationship with these regulated betting entities overseas.
The partnerships are all about gathering data. Take the NFL's deal with Sportradar. The league gets an ownership stake in the company, and Sportradar gets exclusive rights to the NFL's official live stream of real-time scores, player statistics, and play-by-play figures, data that the agreement says it can't sell to gambling outlets. But the deal has raised eyebrows because Sportradar's primary business is selling sports data, including NFL numbers it generates on its own, to bookmaking clients in Europe, Asia, and Nevada.
There doesn't seem to be an opposition to having an investment in entities that constantly run lines and participating directly with entities that have relationships with sports betting apps.
But the fan engagement possibility may be too attractive for leagues to ignore.
There's massive, massive sports betting going on in this country.
In 2014, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver became the first major U.S. sports leader to advocate legalized gambling on sports.
Estimates are that it's up to $400 billion a year. And my view, if it's going to go on, let's make it, transparent. Let's bring it into the sunlight, so to speak, and let's regulate it the same way we do a lot of other industries.
In July, the NBA set another first, buying an ownership stake in daily fantasy company FanDuel, which later acquired a small tech company called NumberFire. NumberFire offers daily fantasy and sports betting analysis, including recommendations on the league's own games.
I think what it says is that, they're willing to recognize regulation, they're willing to recognize the legality, and it seems to indicate that they're willing to ignore the whole integrity of the game issue.
As for Major League Baseball, it recently partnered with a London-based company called Sport Integrity Monitor to check betting lines to spot fixed games. SportIM's parent company sets odds for foreign bookmakers.
They're making all these, moral arguments essentially about why, sports betting shouldn't be allowed. But at the same time, they've got deals with some of these organizations that are involved with the bookmakers. I mean, what's really going on is they want to monopolize the money.
I think every industry has to look at where they fit on that spectrum.
Nevada State Senator Mark Liparelli is the former chairman of the state's Gaming Control Board. He currently consults organizations, including professional sports leagues, on gambling.
Why do you think the NBA has been public about this and the others have really shied away from talking about these relationships?
I think they're probably in a phase of analysis right now. Where does this fit, and if it's going to be legalized, what's our position? And I think clearly the leagues are looking at it from the perspective of this is a business. It's a thriving business in many markets. I think everybody that's in that ecosystem has to be ready, including the sports leagues.
Paula Levine reporting. Now, officials from the leagues involved declined to speak with Outside the Lines for the story, and representatives of the companies did not want to speak with us on camera. And full disclosure, ESPN has business relationships with the companies NumberFire and Stats, and ESPN International has an advertising deal with BetChris. The online reporting of this issue at ESPN.com carries Paula Levine's byline and also that of David Purdom and Steve Fainaru. And Steve now joins us. Good to see you, Steve. And these leagues, when confronted with these business relationships, choose to answer in different ways. Parse that for us.
Well, I think it's interesting because the leagues individually are trying to sort out exactly how to present themselves. And so you get, very different presentations about how they feel about this, while at the same time their actions sort of speak for themselves. So you have, for example, the NFL, which is saying that it's adamantly opposed to sports betting, that it's bad for the sport, while at the same time, as the piece points out, entering into a business relationship, an equity partnership with Sportradar, which is primary business is selling data to bookmakers. Now, the NFL is saying that its relationship is with the U.S. subsidiary, but I think to some people that feels like a very sort of thin line. And then you have the NBA, which has been very transparent about the way it's dealing with this. Adam Silver has been out front in taking a leadership position and saying that this business has become so huge that it needs to be regulated, and that the time has come for it to be legal and overseen by the federal government. And at the same time, it's pursuing very transparently a number of business relationships that would suggest it's trying to prepare the runway for that eventuality.
You know, there are official positions, though, despite what Silver's doing, and as you said, preparing possibly for a new era and speaking out as he did when he first took power about a year and a half ago. Each league can point to a problem which would justify its opposition to gambling. MLB looks at the 1919 World Series. There's the Tim Donaghy situation with the NBA. The NFL can easily point towards the suspensions of Paul Hornung, Alex Karras back in the early 1960s. But here they are with these business relationships in 2016. Why now?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. One, I think, is that sports betting and gambling generally has become a widely accepted form of entertainment in this country. And I think it's gotten to the point now where it's almost impossible for the leagues to ignore. And I think that their position is they're at the center of a lot of this betting, and that they should be able to reap the benefits from it. And of course, that's another thing that they're taking a look at, is that the numbers are so astronomical. You know, one estimate is that there's $400 billion bet every year on sports, and that the leagues are not reaping much of the benefit from that, and they want to be at the center of it. And then I think there's another issue here that is really interesting, which is that data is driving a lot of this. And so the internet, like many industries, has disrupted the gambling industry to the point now where it's not just betting on a single game, you can bet literally on every play in hundreds of sports happening every day. And I think the leagues are making a calculation that gives you another level of transparency, that if people are having to register and you can see these bets being made in real time, that can flag much more quickly possible irregularities like a match fixing that they'd want to get on top of.
A lesson from tennis, as we've been watching that conversation all week in Australia. Steve Vanderhoof, thanks a great deal. And again, the online story at ESPN.com, which shows the close, integral relationship these companies have with sports gambling using the data purchased from these professional pages. Let's now turn to Daniel Roberts, who's with Yahoo Finance. He covers tech and the business of sports. All right, so the numbers of illegal billions of dollars, 50 times what is legally gambled in this country. But where is the pendulum now culturally in this country towards legalization?
Hi, Bob. I would say, if you look at daily fantasy, it's not unrelated. Fans are going to bet on games. We look at the legal uncertainty around all of this. There's a lot of scrutiny. There's a heating up debate. But one thing is certain in all of this. People are going to continue betting on games. And if it's a $400 billion market, and that's in the U.S. alone, then you have to believe that these leagues are looking down the road and they're deciding we want a piece of this. And I think fans, too, are seeing much less of a stigma around this. I would even compare it to the marijuana industry. I mean, there's much less of a stigma now with companies getting involved and businesses deciding that we don't want to miss out on this potential revenue.
All right, so
if I'm looking 15 years down the road, you see the NFL having an app of its own that allows you to bet within the app, and it shows you video and it shows you replays. They want to be the one-stop shop.
Even though they're outraged or adamant at this point, saying no, they are against, of course, all the gambling. You mentioned daily fantasy sports. And, of course, the seminal issue now, is it a game of skill or is it gambling? Just last night, the Attorney General of Hawaii adding his voice and his opinion to the legal conversation, saying, no, this is gambling. So while there might be an increasing social acceptance of that, the most immediate thing that we see in our daily lives, and people always on their phone, daily fantasy sports here in this country, the legal trend, at least right now, is against the industry.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, you mentioned with the last question about Roger Goodell and the NFL, I think that they're saying one thing, and in practice they're doing another. The NFL Players Association has partnered with DraftKings, and NFL teams are allowed to partner with them. But Roger Goodell talks about the integrity of the game, and that's what makes Adam Silver such a compelling commissioner and so proactive. I think the legal tide right now is really salacious, and you see a lot of outlets reporting on it, and they're interested in the negative headlines. Another state announces that the Attorney General wants to make it it illegal. But eventually, it's going to be hard to keep these companies down when the users are growing so quickly. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people that love doing this, and it's going to be difficult to make it illegal. I mean, they did it with online poker, but it took a long time. So I always tell people, you're not going to see DraftKings and FanDuel going out of business anytime soon.
In the print piece up on ESPN.com, a longtime gambling executive is asked, do you really believe the NFL is opposed to gambling? And the report then says, he laughed. All right, you got about 20 seconds. Do you believe the NFL is opposed to gambling?
I believe Roger Goodell is, but I believe the other people in the NFL know that this is inevitable, and they can't miss out on that money.
Well, there was money at stake in L.A., and that's the way the owners voted recently. Daniel Roberts, thanks so much. We'll continue the conversation on the digital side after 2 p.m. Eastern with OTL Extra. And, of course, you can watch it on the ESPN app and ESPN3.com. Our conversation based on the online piece authored by Steve Fainaru and Paula Levine and also David Purdom about sports leagues and their affiliations with companies that have an integral involvement with sports gambling. And Steve Fainaru continues our conversation. Now, Steve, we were talking on the television side, both you and I, and also as we continue with Daniel Roberts, about the daily fantasy phenomenon, and of course the constancy now of rulings that seem to say from the state's attorneys general across the United States that this is a gambling enterprise, yet this is something that pro football and all the different sports, football does not have an equity interest, everyone is fully invested in this, at the same time so careful to parse their difference and their distance from these other companies. It's a very curious dance.
Yeah, I think it's really going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because a growing number of states are taking the position that these companies are in violation of federal gambling laws. And of course, as you mentioned, both the NBA and Major League Baseball have equity stakes in FanDuel and DraftKings, respectively. And the NFL, of course, most of its teams have some sort of sponsorship agreement with the companies. I think there's a wait and see attitude on the leagues. You know, there's a huge amount of money to be made off these companies. Obviously, hundreds of thousands of people are playing the games. And so I think the government is going to have to sort this out, and it's going to take a long while, I think.
Of course, money talks, we all know, and other arguments will walk. A sense of scale on the possible revenues, given not just the amount that is right now gambled illegally, which could be made legal, but also when we get down to micro betting and increases in technology, how big the pie may grow here for these leagues.
I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that question. Like, when you see the estimates of how much is now being bet unofficially in this country, it ranges from something along the lines of, $50 to $80 billion a year to $400 billion a year, the number that was cited by Adam Silver. And the reality is that nobody knows because it's off the books. I think what we can say, it's a lot of money. It's multiples more than the leagues are making themselves every year. And I think that's frankly one of the reasons why this is such an attractive business. The leagues are generally cautious and have been very cautious around gambling. I think the fact that they are, they are getting into this industry in different ways speaks to the incredible revenue potential that's at stake here. And
then there is the constant logic that you hear. You hear it in Vegas when you talk to people who run the sports books there. You hear it from folks even currently in the tennis story in the investigation, that who better to determine if something funny is going on with a game would be the people handling the money on the game.
Right. And I think that's a persuasive argument, frankly. When you're passing data in real time, which is what's going on now, and people are placing bets in real time, and to place those bets, they have to register and give up their emails and their credit card information. That gives you a lot of information to go on when suddenly, as was the case, seemed to be the case in tennis recently, there's a very anomalous bet that comes through, and it raises questions about the integrity of the contest that's being wagered on. And I think that's a big argument that particularly the NBA is making, that it's better to be inside the tent than outside the tent, and to be able to evaluate this information so we can flag things early.
You're too genteel to complete the Lyndon Johnson quote, but we get the picture. Steve Fainaru, thank you so much. Look it up, Google it if you're a political junkie. You'll understand what we're talking about as we conclude this edition of OTL Extra.